talk about the general things that we see in literature and its background. And the topic today is literature as social science. It's a new kind of a topic. Very few people believe that literature does not belong to humanities and that it belongs to social sciences. But if you look at it from the angle of a developing country like India, then you would notice that literature is not merely literature as an item of consumption to create pleasure. Literature is a useful tool in our hands, and with literature we can affect, influence, change the opinion and the level of awareness of the people who read it. So that way, one way of looking at literature would also be that it is educative in nature and it talks about the social reality also at the same time. Let me in the beginning discuss with you a few words that are in currency these days. The first word that we think of is social history. History is something that belongs to the past, generally to the ancient past or to the medieval past. But so what is social history? History is always political. History talks about the change in the rulers and what one ruler did as a matter of policy was changed by another ruler, and this series of happenings under the headship, under the guidance of the rulers, that is called history. But what is social history? So please think about it. Social history is about the history not of the powerful people. History is of the society itself, and that society consists of the upper classes, the middle classes, and the lower classes. And if there is social history, then it will discuss not merely policies or victories and defeats of people, of kings. It will also talk about the social conditions. It will talk about poverty. It will talk about economic problems. It will talk about social problems. It will talk about rituals. It will talk about conventions, something that we discuss in our daily life. And these things also undergo a kind of change with the passage of time. And therefore, people have started saying in the last 100 years that history is not merely of politicians, of rulers, of the upper classes. History also is social in nature. So it's a new idea. And if this is the new idea, then you think that the area of knowledge, the area of awareness is changing also very fast. The second word that you think of is fiction as a documentary form. It's a new word. It's a new critical word. It's a new critical concept. Fiction generally is novel or a short story. It's a tale that we read, that we imagine through a certain way of presenting the incidents, and literature it also gives pleasure. But is it a documentary form? That's a new idea. That fiction documents. Fiction actually is a kind of statement that is made over a period of time, and it captures the reality in the documentary way. So you have some episode, you have some happening, and then you start documenting it. You start talking about it. You start depicting it. You use words. You use passages. You use whole chapters. And that chapter that is there talks not merely about pleasure. It also talks about the reality of the time, and therefore people have started saying that fiction is a documentary form. It's not like poetry, which talks through images, which talks through lyricism, which talks through word music, which talks through repetition of sounds, so that some kind of a excited state of mind can be captured. Fiction tells us. Fiction talks about certain things. Fiction states, and therefore the novels can be considered documentary in nature. Then the other word, this is quite common and all of you would have heard about it. Let's consider this word. This word is reflection of life. So if you put a camera or if you put a mirror in front of what is going on in the market or at home or on the battlefield, then you can see the reflection of the events there in the mirror or on the camera, and you can then say that this is how life is today. I may not see another city generally, but when I hear about it and I think that and I'm told that some interesting episode has taken place there, then I see the picture of it somewhere. And where is the picture? The picture is in literature. Literature was in the 19th century thought to be a reflection of life. Of course, the idea is as old as the hills, but then you know that as a governing idea, as an idea that would help us understand literature in a different manner, this idea grew only in the 19th century. And people like Matthew Arnold must have heard the name of this critic. Matthew Arnold would have said that literature reflects life, it mirrors life. The fourth thing is also inspired by Matthew Arnold, and he said at one place that life as in itself, it really is. What does it mean? Life as in itself, it really is. Which means that you do not talk about ideas, you don't talk about colors, you talk about the reality of life. So when reality is at the center of discussion in criticism or in literature, then you have a different view of literature. The next word is realism. Realism is very closely linked with the previous idea that life itself is life as in itself, it really is. So that is what realism is. But consider that I'm not talking about the real, I'm talking about realism. There is a difference between realism and real, and the ism part tells us about a larger idea, an idea that can be taken from one place to another, applied to different portrayals of life, and then you can also see that this reflection, this reality is actually happening everywhere, more or less in the same pattern. So you start giving it the name of realism. Finally, after having a look at these 4 or 5 ideas, we reach this conclusion that all these and many others of the kind refer to actual social conditions at the time the literary work was composed. So something is composed in the 18th century, somebody is composed in the 19th century, you read the novels, you read the poetry of those centuries, and then you start imagining that this is how people felt at that time, this is how people thought at that time. And that shows that literature actually is doing the job of something else. It is doing the job of an economic scholar, a social scholar, a scholar of history, because all of them also consider social conditions as things that interest these disciplines. So I start by saying that literature is social science, and all these 5 or 6 things that I've said also are characteristics of social science. Therefore, why can't we say that literature is more than an interesting story and an interesting drama? Literature talks about life, it tells us the reality of life, and therefore it is a social science. Since it's a new idea, I'm taking literature out of the category of humanities and I'm putting it in the category of social science, and these are the things that we generally do these days. Therefore, the question definitely arises in our mind, and this question has to be considered seriously. Also, what to make of literature that had real episodes of history at its center? There is something happens that affects and influences life for, let's say, a number of years. In the 18th century, there were certain things. In India, the first war of independence that happened in 1857 was an event. And literature, should it show interest in this kind of an event which affects life, which inspires people to think along new lines? This is the question I'm asking. And my answer is that there is definitely the aspect of literature dealing with important episodes in history. Episodes of history, events in history, the spectacle of history, the particular happenings in history that involve a large number of people. That is what history is. And if that is happening, there is a situation that you face not for just one day, but for 10 years, 15 years, and the consequences of the situation last still longer than that, then that is called an episode. What should literature do? What does literature do, in fact, So this is the question I'm posing, and you go over it in your own mind. So far as I'm concerned, I would say that episodes in history, episodes at a particular time, also inspire writers to think about them, to wonder about them, to take interest in them, and to represent them in their own way, from their angle, what they understood of it, with the help of words. So this is happening now, and in the context, two famous novels come to mind. These two novels that I'm going to tell you about, these two novels were actually about the events that happened in history. The first novel is A Tale of Two Cities, and this is by Charles Dickens. You know about Charles Dickens, the 19th century English novelist, and one who was called a great realist also. And he wrote a novel called A Tale of Two Cities, where the theme was the French Revolution. In fact, when a student asked me in my class as to what happened in the French Revolution, and she wanted to understand the life pattern there at that time, then I straight away said, instead of going to a history book, just read Charles Dickens' novel, A Tale of Two Cities. And when that novel was read, then the entire thing became alive in the imagination of the readers in the class. And they all said, oh, this is what happened in the French Revolution. So it is a novel, and in the novel, Charles Dickens must be taking some liberties. He was not there at that time inside France where things happened, but then he must have heard, of course he had heard, and then he would have read about things on a daily basis in the newspapers. And England was watching the situation in France very closely. In any case, they are close neighbors, and whatever affects England also affects France, and vice versa. So Dickens knew about what was happening in France in 1789, and that thing was so very decisive, so very crucial for the life of the people in France, that monarchy came to an end, and a parliamentary democracy of a sort, of a particular kind, that emerged. And if that happened, then England also would be interested in knowing as to what is happening in the neighboring country. So this is a novel. I'm not saying it's a history book. I'm not saying you can check details there with reference to actual happenings at that time on particular dates in particular years. But then the essence of the French Revolution is caught beautifully by Dickens in this novel, and therefore one doesn't know whether this should be called a novel or it should be called something else. And I believe that if French life, French manners, French reality, French problems become clear before us, then this is obviously the intention of a historian or sociologist, and that is the intention of Charles Dickens also. So he moves closer than other writers to the actual events in history in this novel. The second novel that I talk about is Tolstoy's War and Peace. As I said, the former depicted the French Revolution of 1789, and the latter dealt in great detail with Napoleon's attack on Russia. Now, just see, it's interesting that Dickens is writing about the French Revolution, and where, of course, Napoleon Bonaparte emerges victorious, and he's the leader of the French Revolution, and the same person then attacks Russia, and then there is a Russian writer called Tolstoy. So not at the same time, he was later, but then he went into the documents, he went into the situations and incidents in France vis-a-vis Russia, and then he wrote a novel. And the novel is much bigger than A Tale of Two Cities. A Tale of Two Cities would be about 300 or 400 pages, but War and Peace is a good 1500 pages. So imagine somebody writes an account of a particular episode in history in 1500 pages. So that would contain a lot of information. So if you have to read about Russian history in the 19th century, early 19th century that is, then it is better to read a novel by Tolstoy. So what is Tolstoy doing? He is presenting a picture. He is of course Russian, and therefore his angle is Russian. And Russia was not playing as important a role in world politics as France was. Russia didn't have colonies of the kind that France had all over the world. So if you want to know the reality of Europe, the reality of France from another angle, then read this novel instead of going to books that analyze economic problems, social problems, political problems of Russia or of France. And then you will see that a kind of education has occurred in your case. If I read, then it has occurred in my case also, and I know better than before. So these two were novels, but they stuck to social and political aspects closely. So just ask this question from yourself. Is novel some kind of an informative tool, a tool that gives you information, and interestingly therefore you also read it, or whether the novel is an act of pure imagination? Most of us generally believe that a novel is an act of pure imagination. The writer imagines something, he just goes into his own mind to create something that he wants to see, that he wants others to see, and the other person can say no. The novelist, the writer, does not show you that which he wants to see. He can also show you that which actually happened, actually took place. So once again, the same question that I started with raises its head in a different manner. In this case, that the novel is performing the role of a book that will tell you important information about countries and societies. So this is one important point that I made, and then I come to the second point. And what is the second point? One way to grasp the sense of social life is to differentiate the phases of change embedded in it. So you want to understand, let's say, the 19th century, then you go to the differentiation. You find the difference between today and that time. That's one way. And when you see the difference in the 19th century conditions and the 20th century conditions, then you start wondering, you start thinking about what made those changes. And those changes actually are vital to the existence of human life, existence of human beings, because those changes have occurred not on a particular day, in a particular year, but it has been occurring all the time. And when things start adding and they keep on adding to the already existing details, then you know that the change has finally come about in 10 or 15 years. So the 19th century differentiated from the 18th century, and the 19th century seen as different from the 20th century. This is what raises important questions before us. So think of the phase of early modernity in England marked by stress on human behavior. Now I am just giving a longish example, and this example will tell you very clearly how writers and thinkers, writers and analysts, writers and historians look at the same thing from different angles, but the purpose is the same. The purpose is to capture the reality existing in that period, in that particular place that the writer has chosen to depict. So this differentiation, and I take the example of early modern England. Now this example will tell us very clearly what literature can do in life. Early modern period is the period of the 14th century, 15th century, 16th century, where modernity is showing its face. Generally, when things are as old as that, whenever I'm talking of 600 years ago or 500 years ago, then I'm not talking of modernity. Things were not modern then. Modern means of today, as of today. But then this modernity, the sense of being, the sense of today, this starts at some point of time, and we see in England that modernity was available very clearly in literature and in life, because life was being mirrored by literature earlier also. So let's take this example of Chaucer's time. Chaucer, belongs to the 14th century, and he is a very keen observer of social happenings. And then there is a historian with us. There is a critic also with us. The historian talks about the 14th century, and the writer, the critic, talks about a writer who also was present in the 14th century, and see the descriptions, how they are more or less similar in nature. So we take this example of early modernity in England at that time, and see how things existed in reality in society at that time, and how they were presented in literature by a writer, in fact a poet. So far we have discussed fiction, but now we come to poetry. It gradually came up, this early modernity, in the period from mid 14th century to the end of the 16th century. The 250 years in question witnessed a rise in critical awareness that caused subtle changes in power structures of the time. If you go to English history, then you take pages from the accounts of the period in the 14th century, in the 15th century, and you realize that the same thing is growing and changing and increasing in those 250 years, and that 16th century shows to you that reality which started happening so many years ago and finally became crystallized. So this critical awareness is important, and then it also creates for us what are called power structures, to which I'll come when the occasion arises. The reflection of the pattern in literature shows decisively in the new social traits and influences working to the detriment of the entrenched moral and religious values. This is the question. This is the point I am making, that you will see that change occurs in life quite decisively, quite clearly. You can straight away say, this is not how England was in the 12th century or in the 13th century. Some change occurred in the 14th century, and once it occurs, then it keeps increasing in size and in appeal. 15th century has that change more in substance than the 14th century, and so on and so forth. And in the 16th century, you have a writer emerging of a different kind entirely than the ones that existed in the 13th century. So then the second point is about entrenched interests. There are people who are already stabilized, who are established, and who want to keep the world under their control in the same manner in which it existed earlier. So a kind of tension emerges. Change is happening, and there are people who accept the change, welcoming it, and there are others who don't want to welcome it. In fact, those who want to stop it, and because they are powerful in society, so they will take measures to stop change from occurring. So this kind of tension can be seen in the 14th century itself, and that tension became a big issue in the 14th century. And then historians talk about this change, and writers also of the time, of the period, then they also started talking about it. So we have in the 14th century a kind of pattern of life that came up, which wasn't the case a few years ago, and that pattern finally became so important that the writers could not any longer overlook it. So we will see in the following discussion the connection between literature, which is imaginatively capturing society, and a scholar who is analyzing that society from the angle of social science. But both of them contend with the same problem, and therefore literature goes quite close to social science than to just giving us pleasure. So I'll take the example further in the other lecture that will follow. Thank you.